Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The history of human conflict is typically written in the blood of soldiers and the steel of weaponry, yet the most decisive factor in the Allied victory during World War II was arguably a silent, intellectual struggle waged in the back rooms of country estates and nondescript office buildings. This was the War of the Codebreakers, a group of mathematicians, linguists, chess players, and crossword enthusiasts who dismantled the secret communications of the Axis powers without ever firing a single shot. Their work, hidden under the highest classifications of secrecy for decades, is now recognized as having shortened the war by at least 2 years and saved millions of lives. To understand the magnitude of this achievement, one must delve into the pre-war landscape of cryptography, which was dominated by a belief in the absolute security of mechanical encryption. The centerpiece of this belief was the German Enigma machine, a device that appeared to offer an infinite number of cryptographic possibilities. The Enigma was not merely a machine, it was a symbol of German technical superiority, a rotor-based cipher system that scrambled messages into a nearly impenetrable wall of gibberish. Each press of a key on the Enigma keyboard sent an electrical impulse through a series of rotating wheels, or rotors, which changed the electrical path and thus the resulting letter for every single character. By the time a message was sent, the sequence of encryption was so complex that the odds of guessing the settings were billions to one. The Germans believed that even if a machine were captured, the sheer mathematical complexity of the daily settings would prevent any meaningful decryption. This arrogance was their first mistake. The second was the failure to account for the brilliance of a small group of Polish mathematicians in the early 1930s. While British and French intelligence services were still largely focused on traditional linguistic cryptanalysis, the Polish Cipher Bureau, known as Bureau Chiffreau, realized that the Enigma was a mathematical problem that required a mathematical solution. Marian Rejewski, a young mathematician who had studied at Poznan University, was the primary architect of this breakthrough. By applying the principles of group theory and permutations, Rejewski was able to derive the internal wiring of the Enigma's rotors without ever having seen one. This was a feat of pure logic that remains one of the most stunning intellectual achievements in history. Alongside his colleagues Jerzy Rositzky and Henryk Zygalski, Rejewski developed the Bomba, an electromechanical device designed to automate the process of finding the Enigma settings. They also created Zygalski sheets, perforated overlays that helped identify the rotor positions. By the mid-1930s, the Poles were reading a significant portion of German military traffic. However, as the Germans increased the complexity of the Enigma by adding more rotors and a plugboard, or Steckerbrett, the Polish resources were stretched to their limit. In July 1939, with the shadow of invasion looming, the Poles made a fateful decision to share their secrets with the British and French. During a secret meeting in the Pirai Forest near Warsaw, they handed over replica Enigma machines and their mathematical findings. This transfer of knowledge provided the foundation upon which the British would build their massive intelligence operation at Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park, located in Buckinghamshire, was designated as Station X. It became the headquarters of the Government Code and Cipher School, or GC&CS. Under the leadership of Alistair Denniston and later Edward Travis, Bletchley Park evolved from a small collection of scholars into a sprawling industrial complex employing over 10,000 people. The atmosphere was one of intense, pressurized intellectual labor. The recruits were often unconventional. Rather than searching for traditional military minds, the British sought out those with a specific type of lateral thinking. They recruited from the mathematics departments of Cambridge and Oxford, but they also held crossword competitions in national newspapers and sought out champions of the game of bridge. This eclectic group of boffins was tasked with cracking the ciphers of the German Army, Air Force, and Navy. The most famous among them was Alan Turing, a man whose work would not only help win the war but also lay the theoretical groundwork for modern computing. Turing recognized that the human brain alone could not keep pace with the Enigma's daily setting changes. He improved upon the Polish designs to create the British Bombay, a massive, humming machine that used a process of elimination to find the Enigma settings. The Bombay worked by searching for cribs, short stretches of plaintext that were likely to appear in a message, such as Heil Hitler, or standard weather report phrases. By testing these cribs against the encrypted text, the Bombay could discard millions of incorrect settings in a matter of minutes. The success of Bletchley Park was not immediate, nor was it consistent. The German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, used a much more complex version of the Enigma for its U-boat fleet. This version featured additional rotors and a more rigorous set of operating procedures. For long periods, the British were unable to read the naval Enigma, leading to catastrophic losses in the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boats, operating in wolf packs, were strangling the British Isles by sinking merchant ships bringing vital supplies from North America. The struggle to break the shark cipher, as the British called it, was a race against time. It required not just mathematical genius but also physical bravery. Since the Navy's codes were so difficult to break through pure analysis, the British relied on pinches, the physical capture of codebooks and machines from German vessels. One of the most significant pinches occurred in May 1941, when the crew of the HMS Bulldog captured U-110 and recovered its Enigma machine and secret documents. This allowed the cryptanalysts in Hut 8, led by Turing and later Joan Clark, to finally penetrate the U-boat communications. The intelligence gained from this, codenamed Ultra, allowed the Admiralty to reroute convoys away from known U-boat positions and to send destroyers directly to the locations of the German submarines. The impact was profound, shipping losses plummeted, and the momentum of the Atlantic War shifted in favor of the Allies. The work at Bletchley Park was organized into huts, each with a specific focus. Hut 6 handled the decryption of German Army and Air Force Enigma traffic, while Hut 3 processed and analyzed the resulting intelligence. Hut 8 focused on the naval Enigma, and Hut 4 analyzed the maritime intelligence. This compartmentalization was essential for security, as it ensured that very few people knew the full extent of what was being achieved. The intelligence reports were heavily disguised before being sent to military commanders. They were often presented as coming from a fictional master spy named Boniface, or from aerial reconnaissance to prevent the Germans from suspecting that their codes had been compromised. The maintenance of the ultra-secret was perhaps the greatest security operation of the war. Even when intelligence revealed that an Allied city like Coventry was about to be bombed, the leadership had to make the agonizing decision of how much to intervene without tipping their hand. While the myth that Churchill allowed Coventry to be destroyed to protect Ultra has been largely debunked by historians, the underlying dilemma was real. The long-term value of the intelligence was so high that it often necessitated local sacrifices. As the war progressed, the Germans introduced even more sophisticated encryption systems. The Lorenz cipher, used by the German High Command for strategic messages between Hitler and his generals, was significantly more complex than the Enigma. It was a teleprinter cipher that used 12 rotors to generate a pseudo-random key. Unlike the Enigma, the Lorenz machine was never captured during the war. Its secrets were unraveled through pure intellectual effort after a German operator made a critical mistake. In August 1941, an operator sent two versions of the same message with the same settings, but with slight variations in the text. This depth allowed cryptanalyst John Tiltman to identify the key and mathematician Bill Tutte to reverse engineer the entire mechanical structure of the Lorenz machine without ever having seen one. To automate the decryption of Lorenz, which was too complex even for the bombs, the British developed Colossus. Designed by the engineer Tommy Flowers, Colossus was the world's first large-scale electronic digital computer. It used thousands of vacuum tubes to process data at incredible speeds, allowing the codebreakers to read the most sensitive strategic communications of the Third Reich. The intelligence from Lorenz provided the Allies with a clear view of the German military's high-level plans, including their reactions to the D-Day deceptions. In the Pacific Theater, a parallel intellectual war was being fought against the Japanese Empire. The Americans had their own code-breaking successes, most notably against the Japanese diplomatic cipher known as Purple. The U.S. Army's Signals Intelligence Service, led by the brilliant William Friedman, succeeded in building a replica of the Purple machine in 1940. The intelligence derived from Purple, codenamed Magic, provided the U.S. government with a window into Japanese diplomatic strategy. However, the most critical naval breakthroughs occurred at the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, or FRUPAC, located in a basement in Hawaii known as the Dungeon. There, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team worked on the Japanese Navy's operational code, JN-25. Unlike the mechanical Enigma, JN-25 was a codebook-based system where numbers represented words and phrases, which were then further scrambled by an additive table. Rochefort's team was a mix of linguists and musicians, chosen for their ability to recognize patterns in the flow of Japanese signals. Their work reached its zenith in the lead-up to the Battle of Midway. By intercepting and analyzing JN-25 messages, Rochefort identified a major Japanese offensive aimed at a target designated as AF. To confirm that AF was Midway, the Americans orchestrated a ruse. They sent an unencrypted message from Midway claiming that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. When a Japanese intercept subsequently reported that AF is low on water, the target was confirmed. This allowed Admiral Nimitz to ambush the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 carriers and turning the tide of the Pacific War. The human element of codebreaking extended beyond the famous mathematicians. Thousands of women, particularly in the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRENS, in Britain and the Women's Army Corps, WACs, in the United States, performed the grueling daily labor that made decryption possible. At Bletchley Park, WRENS operated the bombs and Colossus machines, working in shifts around the clock in noisy, poorly ventilated rooms. They were responsible for the physical task of plugging in the settings and monitoring the machines for stops. In the U.S., thousands of women worked in the massive Arlington Hall complex, painstakingly cataloging intercepted Japanese messages and looking for the additive keys that would unlock JN-25. These women were sworn to absolute secrecy, and many never told their families about their contributions until decades later. The War of the Codebreakers was also a war of the Y service, the vast network of radio intercept stations located across the globe. These operators spent their lives in front of receivers, tuning into the faint, crackling sounds of Morse code. They had to be experts in identifying the fist of individual German or Japanese operators, a unique rhythmic signature that could identify a specific unit or ship even before its message was decrypted. This traffic analysis was a vital component of signal intelligence, providing a map of the enemy's order of battle based solely on the volume and origin of radio transmissions. The strategic consequences of codebreaking were felt in every theater. In North Africa, the interception of Italian and German naval ciphers allowed the British to decimate the supply lines of General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. Rommel, often praised for his tactical genius, was frequently left without fuel or reinforcements because the Royal Navy knew exactly when and where his tankers would be. In the lead-up to the invasion of Normandy, the intelligence from Ultra and Magic confirmed that the German High Command had been successfully deceived by Operation Fortitude. The Allies knew that Hitler was holding his panzer divisions in the Pas-de-Calais, believing the Normandy landings were merely a feint. This knowledge gave Eisenhower the confidence to proceed with the invasion, knowing that the German response would be delayed and disorganized. Without this certainty, the D-Day landings could have ended in a catastrophic repulse. The War of the Codebreakers did not end with the cessation of hostilities. As the world moved into the Cold War, the techniques developed at Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall became the foundation for the NSA and GCHQ. The transition from mechanical to electronic decryption marked the birth of the information age. However, the immediate post-war period was one of erasure. Winston Churchill ordered the destruction of the bombs and Colossus machines to ensure that no other power, especially the Soviet Union, could learn how the British had mastered the art of decryption. The codebreakers themselves were returned to civilian life with strict orders never to speak of their work. For many, this meant that their greatest life achievements remained unrecognized for a generation. Alan Turing's post-war life was a particularly tragic example of this. Despite his service, he was prosecuted for his homosexuality and subjected to chemical castration, eventually taking his own life in 1954. It was only in the 1970s, with the publication of The Ultra Secret by F.W. Winterbotham, that the public began to learn the truth about the silent war. The legacy of the codebreakers is a testament to the power of the intellect over brute force. They proved that in the modern era, the most powerful weapon on the battlefield is information. By breaking the ciphers of the Axis, they stripped away the veil of secrecy that is essential for military operations. They forced the enemy to fight a war in which their every move was known, their every strategy anticipated, and their every vulnerability exposed. This was not a war won by a single brilliant stroke, but by the accumulation of millions of small observations, the persistence of thousands of workers, and the application of abstract mathematics to the most concrete of human problems. The codebreakers were the vanguard of a new kind of warfare, one that is fought in the electromagnetic spectrum and the silicon chips of computers. Their story is a reminder that the pursuit of truth, even in the midst of the most violent conflict, can be the most effective way to secure peace. They were the silent architects of victory, the men and women who fought the war without ever firing a shot, and in doing so, they reshaped the world. To dive deeper into the technical brilliance of Bletchley Park, one must look at the specific methods used to attack the enigma. One of the most important was Banburismus, a technique developed by Alan Turing that used the principle of sequential analysis and conditional probability. By using large sheets of paper from the town of Banbury, codebreakers could compare two intercepted messages to see if they had been encrypted using the same rotor settings. This allowed them to narrow down the possible rotor orders without having to run a Bombay for every possibility, saving precious time. Another critical method was the use of SILIS, which were the repeated characters or predictable patterns left by lazy German operators. Despite the sophistication of the enigma, human error remained the greatest vulnerability. Operators often chose obvious three-letter combinations for their daily settings or repeated the same messages day after day. The codebreakers exploited these human failings with ruthless efficiency. This interplay between high-level mathematics and the psychological profiling of the enemy operators was what made Bletchley Park so successful. It was not just about the machines, it was about understanding the human beings who used them. The Lorenz cipher, or tunny, as it was known at Bletchley, represented a different level of challenge altogether. While the Enigma was a tactical tool used by field units, the Lorenz was a strategic machine used for the highest levels of communication. Breaking it required a level of mathematical intuition that went beyond anything seen before. Bill Tutte's feat of deducing the structure of the Lorenz machine from a single intercepted transmission is often cited as the greatest individual act of cryptanalysis in the war. He realized that the machine used two sets of wheels, the K wheels, which moved with every character, and the S wheels, which moved irregularly. By isolating the patterns in the K wheels, Tutte was able to provide the blueprint that Tommy Flowers used to build Colossus. Colossus was a revolutionary machine, not just for its role in the war, but for its use of 1,500 vacuum tubes to perform logical operations. It was the first time that electronics had been used on such a scale for computation, and it paved the way for the development of the ENIAC and the subsequent computer revolution. The intelligence produced by Colossus, particularly regarding the German FISH network, was so sensitive that it was delivered directly to the Prime Minister. In the Pacific, the success against the Japanese was equally reliant on the fusion of technology and human intuition. The breaking of the Purple cipher was a triumph of the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service. William Friedman and his team, including the brilliant Frank Rowlett and Genevieve Grotjen, spent years struggling with the Japanese diplomatic system. Grotjen's discovery of a specific pattern in the Purple code in September 1940 was the eureka moment that allowed the team to finally build a functional analog of the Japanese machine. This gave the U.S. government access to the communications between the Japanese Foreign Office and its embassies worldwide. It revealed Japan's strengthening ties with Germany and Italy and provided early warnings of their expansionist intentions in Southeast Asia. While Magic Intelligence did not provide a specific date and time for the Pearl Harbor attack, it clearly showed that Japan had decided on war with the United States. The failure to prevent Pearl Harbor was not a failure of the codebreakers, but a failure of the intelligence bureaucracy to synthesize and act upon the information they provided. After Pearl Harbor, the focus shifted to the Japanese Navy. The JN-25 code was a massive system of over 30,000 five-digit groups. Every few months, the Japanese would change the code book and the additive tables, forcing the Americans to start over. The work at FRUPAC in Hawaii was performed in an atmosphere of incredible tension. Joseph Rochefort, who famously wore a smoking jacket and slippers to keep warm in the basement, led a team that worked 18-hour days. Their ability to read the Japanese Navy's intentions through JN-25 was the deciding factor in the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway. At the Coral Sea, the codebreakers identified the Japanese plan to invade Port Moresby, allowing the U.S. to intercept their invasion fleet and prevent the isolation of Australia. At Midway, their work allowed the U.S. to achieve the greatest naval victory in its history. The assassination of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in 1943 was another triumph of signal intelligence. By decrypting a message detailing Yamamoto's travel plans, the U.S. was able to execute a precision strike that killed the architect of the Japanese naval strategy. This was perhaps the most direct application of codebreaking to the elimination of an enemy leader in history. The global nature of the signal intelligence war meant that the Allies were constantly sharing information. The special relationship between the US and the UK was forged in the exchange of cryptanalytic secrets. In 1941, a British delegation visited the US and shared the secrets of Enigma, while the Americans shared their work on Purple. This cooperation was formalized in the Brusa Agreement of 1943, which set the stage for the post-war intelligence alliance. The integration of signal intelligence into military operations was a radical shift. In previous wars, intelligence was often anecdotal or arrived too late to be of use. In World War II, it was real-time and strategic. Commanders like Montgomery and Eisenhower became dependent on Ultra, using it to verify their plans and anticipate enemy counterattacks. The role of the Special Liaison Units, SLUS, was to deliver this intelligence to the front lines securely. These units ensured that the intelligence reached the commanders who needed it while maintaining the secrecy of the source. The environmental conditions of the codebreakers were often as grueling as those on the front lines, though in a different way. At Bletchley Park, the huts were drafty in the winter and stifling in the summer. The constant noise of the bombs and the teleprinters created a high-stress environment. Many codebreakers suffered from exhaustion and nervous breakdowns. William Friedman's breakdown in 1940 was a direct result of the mental strain of breaking Purple. Alan Turing's social awkwardness and idiosyncratic behavior were both a source of friction and a reflection of the intense focus required for his work. Yet, despite these challenges, the sense of purpose at Bletchley Park was palpable. The workers knew they were doing something that mattered, even if they couldn't tell anyone about it. The secrecy was so ingrained that even after the war, many former Bletchley employees would simply say they had been doing clerical work or government service. As we consider the historical impact of these individuals, we must also recognize the ethical complexities they faced. The decision to act on intelligence was always a gamble. If the Allies moved too perfectly against the Germans would inevitably realize their codes were broken. To prevent this, the Allies often engaged in deception through action. They would send reconnaissance planes to discover a target that they already knew about through Ultra, providing a plausible reason for their subsequent attack. They also developed the double cross system, where captured German spies were turned into double agents. These agents fed the Germans a mix of true and false information, all of which was tailored to match what the Allies knew the Germans were hearing through their own decrypted signals. This created a hall of mirrors that kept the German intelligence services in a state of constant confusion. The technological leap from the mechanical age to the electronic age was accelerated by decades because of the war. The development of Colossus and the Bombay was the catalyst for the digital revolution. Men like Alan Turing and Tommy Flowers were the pioneers of what we now call computer science. Turing's 1936 paper on computable numbers provided the theory, but the war provided the necessity and the funding to build the machines. The post-war era saw the rapid development of these ideas into the first commercial computers. However, the secrecy surrounding Bletchley Park meant that the true origins of the computer were hidden for years. Instead, the credit often went to American projects like ENIAC, which, while significant, were built on the foundations laid by the World War II codebreakers. In conclusion, the codebreakers were the essential silent partners in every Allied victory. From the freezing waters of the North Atlantic to the tropical heat of the Solomon Islands, their work provided the clarity and foresight that military force alone could not achieve. They were a diverse group of individuals who shared a common trait, an obsession with the truth hidden within the noise. They looked at the chaos of encrypted signals and saw the patterns of the enemy's mind. They fought a war of pure intellect, and their victory was the preservation of freedom. As we live in an age defined by encryption, data, and global communication, we owe a debt to the men and women of Bletchley Park, Arlington Hall, and the dungeon, who first mastered the art of the secret war. They were the architects of a silent victory, and their legacy is the world we inhabit today. Their brilliance, their dedication, and their silence changed the course of history forever. The detail of their work also involved a sophisticated understanding of linguistics. In the case of the Japanese codes, the challenge was not just the encryption but the language itself. Japanese is a language of extreme nuance and hierarchy, and the military and diplomatic versions were vastly different from the everyday speech. The codebreakers had to be more than just mathematicians. they had to be cultural analysts. They had to understand the Japanese mindset to correctly interpret the meaning of certain phrases. This was also true for the British working on German codes. They had to know the structure of the German bureaucracy to understand where a message was coming from and what its significance was. The synthesis of linguistic expertise and mathematical precision was the secret weapon of the Allied intelligence services. The Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941 is another striking example of Ultra's tactical impact. By decrypting Italian naval signals, the British Mediterranean Fleet, led by Admiral Cunningham, was able to intercept a superior Italian force off the coast of Greece. The resulting victory was a devastating blow to the Italian Navy, which never again challenged the British in the open sea. This victory was made possible because the British knew the exact composition and destination of the Italian fleet before it even left port. This foreknowledge was the defining characteristic of the war's intelligence-driven campaigns. It allowed the Allies to punch far above their weight, using their limited resources with surgical precision. The story of the codebreakers is also a story of the evolution of secrecy. Before the war, intelligence was often a disorganized affair. The war forced the creation of modern intelligence agencies with standardized procedures for classification, distribution, and security. The need to know principle was refined at Bletchley Park to ensure that the most sensitive information was protected. This culture of secrecy, while necessary during the war, had long-term consequences for the transparency of government. The tension between the need for state secrets and the public's right to know is a legacy that we still grapple with today. The codebreakers were the first to operate in this modern paradigm, where the most important assets of the state are not physical territories but intellectual secrets. Reflecting on the sheer volume of messages processed is staggering. By 1944, Bletchley Park was decrypting and translating over 2,000 messages a day. Each of these messages had to be cross-referenced with previous intelligence to build a comprehensive picture of the enemy's situation. This required an enormous card index system, which functioned as a prehistoric database. Thousands of workers, mostly women, spent their days filing and retrieving cards that tracked the movement of every German unit, every ship, and every high-ranking officer. This industrialization of intelligence was what allowed the Allies to maintain their advantage even as the war grew in complexity. It was a victory of organization as much as it was a victory of genius. The codebreakers' influence on the air war was equally significant. During the Battle of Britain, the RAF used intelligence from intercepted Luftwaffe communications to anticipate the size and direction of incoming raids. While radar was the primary tool for detection, the intelligence from Bletchley Park provided the big picture of the Luftwaffe's strength and intentions. Later in the war, during the Allied bombing campaign against Germany, Ultra provided detailed information on the damage caused to German industry and the effectiveness of German air defenses. This allowed the Allies to adjust their targets and tactics to maximize the pressure on the German war machine. The oil campaign of 1944, which targeted German fuel production, was guided by Ultra reports that showed the desperate state of German fuel supplies. This intelligence-led strategy brought the German military to a virtual standstill by the end of the year. The moral weight of their work was constant. In the Pacific, the Americans had to decide how much of their knowledge of Japanese atrocities to reveal. In Europe, the Allies had to balance the protection of Ultra with the humanitarian need to intervene in the Holocaust. While there is evidence that the Allies had some knowledge of the final solution, through decrypted railway schedules and police reports, the focus was always on the primary goal of winning the war as quickly as possible. The belief was that the only way to end the atrocities was to achieve a total military victory. The codebreakers provided the tools for that victory, but they also lived with the burden of knowing about the horrors they were trying to stop. As the years pass, the figures of the codebreakers have become legends. Turing, Rochefort, Friedman, and Clark are now seen as the intellectual heroes of the 20th century. Their work represents a unique moment in history where the power of the human mind was the most critical factor in a global struggle. They did not seek fame or recognition, they sought solutions. Their contribution was silent, their weapons were abstract, and their victory was absolute. They were the ones who saw through the fog of war, who turned the enemy's secrets against them, and who proved that in the end, knowledge is the greatest power of all. The world they helped save is a world that was built on the foundations of their silent, intellectual labor. The final days of the war saw the codebreakers working even harder to track the disintegration of the Axis. In the closing weeks of the war in Europe, Ultra followed the movement of German leaders as they fled Berlin. In the Pacific, the codebreakers tracked the movements of the remaining Japanese ships as they were hunted down by the U.S. Navy. The end of the war was not just a military victory but an intelligence triumph. The transition to peace was also an intelligence operation, as the Allies used their knowledge to track down war criminals and to understand the new geopolitical reality of the Soviet threat. The codebreakers had become indispensable, and their role in the post-war world was just beginning. The legacy of these individuals is also preserved in the physical locations where they worked. Bletchley Park is now a museum, a place of pilgrimage for those who want to understand the origins of the digital age. The Dungeon in Hawaii and Arlington Hall in Virginia remain significant sites in the history of American intelligence. These places serve as a reminder that the most important events of history often happen in ordinary places, through the efforts of ordinary people who are capable of extraordinary things. The codebreakers were the quiet vanguard of the future, and their story remains an inspiration for all who believe in the power of the mind to overcome even the darkest challenges. They fought a war of numbers, logic, and patterns, and in doing so, they ensured that the future would be written not in the language of tyranny, but in the language of freedom. The analytical depth required for this work cannot be overstated. When we look at the Lorenz cipher, the complexity of the task becomes even more apparent. The Lorenz SC40 and SC42 machines were used by the High Command to send messages via teleprinter. The decryption of these messages, known as tunny, was what led to the creation of the testery and the numery at Bletchley Park. The testery, named after Ralph Tester, was responsible for the linguistic and manual cryptanalysis, while the numery, named after Max Newman, focused on the mechanical and mathematical methods. This division of labor was the precursor to the modern software and hardware departments of technology companies. The collaboration between Tute, the mathematician who broke the structure, and Flowers, the engineer who built the machine, is a perfect example of the interdisciplinary approach that defined Bletchley Park's success. The Colossus machine itself was a masterpiece of engineering. With 2,500 vacuum tubes in its second version, it was able to perform Boolean calculations at high speed. It read 5-hole punch tape at 5,000 characters per second, allowing the codebreakers to test the Lorenz settings in a fraction of the time it would have taken manually. The information it produced gave the Allies an unprecedented look into the mind of the German High Command. They could read Hitler's own orders to his generals, often within hours of them being sent. This level of strategic insight is unique in the history of warfare. It allowed the Allies to understand not just what the German army was doing, but why they were doing it and what they planned to do next. The role of codebreaking in the deception for D-Day, known as Operation Fortitude, was perhaps its greatest strategic success. The Allies created a fictional army, the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, under the command of General George Patton, and positioned it in southeast England, directly across from the Pas de Calais. Through Ultra, the Allies could see that the Germans were completely convinced by this deception. They watched as the German High Command moved their best divisions to the Pas de Calais and kept them there even after the landings in Normandy had begun. The ability to monitor the enemy's reaction to a deception in real time is a commander's dream, and Ultra made it a reality. It allowed the Allies to maintain the element of surprise long after the initial landings, ensuring the success of the most complex military operation in history. In the Pacific, the decryption of the Japanese merchant shipping codes, known as the Maru codes, was a vital but less celebrated achievement. By reading these codes, the U.S. Navy could track the movements of the Japanese merchant fleet, which carried the resources necessary for the Japanese war effort. American submarines used this intelligence to conduct a devastating campaign of commerce raiding, eventually sinking over 90% of the Japanese merchant fleet. This strangled the Japanese economy and left their military forces in the field without the food, fuel, and ammunition they needed to fight. This was a war of attrition won through the application of intelligence to the logistical vulnerabilities of the enemy. The story of the codebreakers is also a story of the personal sacrifices they made. Many worked themselves into the ground, suffering from chronic fatigue and stress. The nature of the work was repetitive and often frustrating, with long periods of silence followed by a frantic rush when a code was broken. The social isolation of Bletchley Park, while necessary for security, was difficult for many of the young men and women stationed there. Yet, they formed a close-knit community, bound together by their shared secret. The intellectual camaraderie of the Huts was a unique phenomenon, a gathering of some of the brightest minds of a generation focused on a single, vital goal. The post-war classification of these achievements meant that the contributions of many key figures were unrecognized during their lifetimes. Tommy Flowers, the creator of Colossus, returned to his job at the post office and was never given the public recognition he deserved for his role in the computer revolution. Bill Tutte moved to Canada and became a renowned professor of mathematics, but his wartime work remained a secret for decades. The silence was absolute. It was only in the late 20th century that the true history of the war began to be rewritten to include the work of the codebreakers. This process of rediscovery is still ongoing, as more documents are declassified and more stories are told. The significance of the Polish contribution remains a central part of this narrative. Without the early work of Rajewski and his team, the British would have started the war in a much weaker position. The Polish breakthrough was the essential catalyst that set the entire Allied cryptanalytic effort in motion. It is a reminder that in the face of overwhelming odds, intellectual courage and mathematical brilliance can change the course of history. The Poles were the first to recognize that the era of linguistic-based ciphers was over and that the future of cryptography lay in the realm of mathematics. Their legacy is the very foundation of modern signal intelligence. The development of the Y-Service radio intercept network was also a monumental logistical achievement. Thousands of intercept stations were built across the British Empire and the United States, from the cliffs of Dover to the deserts of North Africa and the islands of the Pacific. These stations were the eyes and ears of the codebreakers. The operators had to be highly skilled in Morse code and have the patience to listen through the static for hours on end. They were often the first to know when a major operation was beginning, as the volume of radio traffic would spike. The integration of this raw data into the analytical machine at Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall was a triumph of organizational efficiency. The human-centric nature of cryptanalysis is also seen in the work against the Japanese Navy. The Japanese code talkers, or the Navajo Marines used by the United States, represent the flip side of this struggle. While the US was breaking the Japanese codes, they were using a language that the Japanese could not break. The Navajo language, with its complex grammar and lack of a written form, was used to send tactical messages on the battlefield. This was a human encryption system that was just as effective as the mechanical machines. It highlights the diversity of the intelligence war, which involved everything from high-level mathematics to the use of ancient indigenous languages. As we conclude this analysis, we must look at the codebreakers as the pioneers of the digital world. Their work forced the transition from physical labor to machine-assisted logic. They invented the concepts of algorithms, data processing, and electronic computation. They showed that the most complex problems can be broken down into smaller, solvable parts. Their legacy is not just a military victory, but a fundamental change in the way we understand and interact with the world. They were the first to live in the information age, and their success proved that in the modern world, the most important battles are won by those who can master the flow of information. They were the codebreakers, the silent warriors who fought a war of pure mind and, in doing so, changed the world forever. The codebreakers' journey from the 1930s into the aftermath of the war is a narrative of profound transformation. Initially, the British Old Guard at the GC&CS was skeptical of the mathematical approach. It was the younger generation, the men of the New World, who pushed for the inclusion of science and technology in the intelligence process. This tension between the old ways of traditional espionage and the new ways of technical intelligence was a microcosm of the broader shifts happening in society. The war was the catalyst that finally broke the old structures and allowed the new ones to emerge. The victory of the codebreakers was also a victory for the scientific method and the belief that the world is inherently rational and understandable. The sheer persistence of the codebreakers is perhaps their most admirable trait. They faced constant setbacks. Every time the Germans or Japanese changed a rotor or a codebook, the codebreakers were plunged back into darkness. Yet, they never gave up. They analyzed every scrap of information, looking for the smallest crack in the enemy's defenses. This relentless pursuit of the truth is what allowed them to overcome the technical superiority of the Axis machines. It was a war of attrition of the mind, and the Allies had the intellectual stamina to see it through to the end. The silent rooms of Bletchley Park and the hot basements of Hawaii were the arenas where this stamina was tested every day, and every day the codebreakers rose to the challenge. Their impact on the history of the 20th century is unparalleled. They did not just win a war, they created the tools that would define the next century. The computer, the internet, and the modern global intelligence network all trace their lineage back to the work done at Station X in Arlington Hall. The codebreakers were the first to recognize that the physical world is increasingly governed by invisible signals, and that the ability to intercept and understand these signals is the key to power. They were the silent architects of the modern world, and their story is a powerful reminder that the most significant changes in history are often driven by the quiet work of those who seek to understand the hidden patterns of the world. By breaking the codes of their enemies, they unlocked the potential of the human mind and set the stage for a new era of human progress.